Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of my Cold War introduction. Today, Causes episode, I want to go over some of the things that America said or wrote which helped transform relations from between America and the Soviet Union from being a bit kind of awkward, a bit prickly, into full-on hostility. It's easy to look at these things and see the conflict as being provoked by the Soviets and the Americans responding to that because they're talking about current situation. But if you're going to argue, and you could see it that way, you could see that this is proof that actually Soviets have acted, and here America reacting. The Cold War has already started. But you can also see it the other way around and say actually the Soviets were acting in a defensive and in a limited way, as we saw last week when we looked at the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe, without ambition to expand any further, and kind of in the confines that they thought had perhaps been suggested to them by the percentage agreement, but that the Americans and to an extent the British misunderstood their actions and massively overreacted to that, therefore ratcheting tensions up from kind of modest to Cold War, to hostility. You can also, and we will talk about this in a future episode, you can also see these words and speeches as being part of a more complex relationship of action and reaction and counter-reaction by the Soviets, and that they're all kind of mushed in together. But just for now, let's focus on the idea that this is the Americans massively overreacting and thereby causing tensions to leap from awkward, bit grumpy with each other, but stable, to hostile and unstable. Mostly I want to kind of just pick through the context of 3 or 4 main bits of evidence here. We're going to start with the long telegram, because that comes first. This is in February 1946. This is written by George Kennan, or composed by George Kennan and then typed from Moscow. He was a diplomat. He was the chief of mission in Moscow and seen as an expert by Washington. And when they were having some awkwardness with the Soviets, they actually kind of asked him, "Now, what's going on? Why are they being so awkward?" And he responded with this literally long telegram, trying to set some context as he saw it for the Soviet reluctance to engage with the Americans. And key to this, so this is literally typed out, encrypted, typed out on an encryptor, and then sent to Washington. And the purpose by Kennan was to try and educate, really, the political elite in Washington that were making decisions. It's not a public document, but the Soviets do learn about it, and there is a response. The Novikov telegram is seen as being a response to this. If you read the extract that will have passed around to you, you can see in there that Kennan really sets Stalin and his government in a wider historical context. He sees Stalin as the latest in the line of a number of Russian rulers, and he sees him as not being particularly ideologically different to those previous rulers. He talks in the opening of the extract that we provide you about the insecurity, the traditional insecurity of Russia. And towards the end of that first paragraph, he says they have always feared foreign penetration into Russia, as they did after the Second World War. They feared direct contact between the Western world and their own. They feared what would happen if Russians learned the truth about the world outside, or if foreigners learned the truth about the world within. So really what he's suggesting there is that Soviet leaders, just like traditional Russian leaders, want to keep Russia isolated and apart from the rest of the world. And then he sets that in a context of Marxism, and he says that basically that is how, why and how communism has thrived in Russia, and that he says Marxist dogma rendered even more truculent and intolerant by Lenin's interpretation. So Lenin kind of ratchets it up and becomes more argumentative and intolerant. it becomes a perfect vehicle for a sense of insecurity with which Bolsheviks, communists, even more than previous Russian rulers, were afflicted. So there's this insecurity, he says, that is at the bottom of how they act and react to things. Now, ironically, the Russians, the Americans don't take that into account at all when they deal with the Russians. He ends by saying, in the new guise of international Marxism, with its honeyed promises to a desperate and war-torn outside world, this is the idea that it's attractive to people who have just been through the Second World War. It's more dangerous and insidious than ever, that it can potentially spread and grow, and that's what the Russians want to happen. Now, George Kennan followed that up, and it's worth seeing these as a pair, with what was called the Mr. X article. This was an anonymous article that he wrote in a journal, but actually everyone knew it was Kennan. He calls himself Mr. X to try and maintain some mystery. Now, again, we've only provided you with a paragraph here of the article, but you can look at the whole thing online if you want. This paragraph, though, is key because it shows what Kennan's advice was about policy coming out of the long telegram and his understanding of Russian nationalism. It says the main element of any United States policy towards the Soviet Union must be that of long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Now, here's the idea that Russia is not just after Eastern Europe, it's looking to expand, and that the Americans must hold them in. Now, if you think of the Russians as being, the Soviets as being limited in their intentions, as I think probably the evidence suggests, certainly, limited in their intentions, then this is definitely a misunderstanding, but it's an aggressive misunderstanding. They're looking to contain the Soviets. And going on from that, he says, we must continue to expect Soviet policies will reflect no abstract love of peace and stability, no real faith in the possibility of a permanent, happy coexistence of the socialist and capitalist worlds. So the Russians aren't out to coexist, or they're not really in favour of peace and stability, but rather, says Kennan in the Mr. X article, rather the Soviets will have a cautioned, persistent pressure towards the disruption and weakening of all rival influence and rival power. So here Kennan kind of couples together what his understanding of Russia in the past and Russia in the present is, and he says they need to be contained and they are going to look to disrupt and undermine us. So this is an interpretation of Soviet action and foreign policy that really sees them as being aggressive and suggests and proposes an aggressive foreign policy as Kennan sees it in reaction to how the Soviets will be. But actually, if you don't think the Russians are being like that, this is an aggressive overreaction to something that the Soviets were doing in a more limited way. Now, very much in that line fits the Iron Curtain speech. The Iron Curtain speech was in March 1946, so only a month after the Long Telegram. And this was very much a public speech by Winston Churchill, who was no longer Prime Minister of Britain, was visiting America, but he was there as the personal guest of President Truman. And Truman knew what Churchill was going to say, and in fact was there when Churchill said it. So this is kind of like, almost like a testing of the water. And Stalin reacts in fury to what Churchill says. The key things here to pick out, and there's a famous bit about how all these capitals are now behind the Iron Curtain, but he says Greece is free to decide its future in an election, and he draws that contrast with these other countries that are having communism imposed upon them. He says in a great number of countries far from the Russian borders and throughout the world, communist fifth columns. These this is an idea talking about basically spies, really, people working within a society to undermine the structure of government. Communist fifth columns are established and work in complete unity and absolute obedience to the directions they receive from the communist centre. He's talking here essentially about how the Soviets are looking to expand and are working to undermine democracy and stability in countries, very much like the Kennan assumptions in his long telegram and then Mr. X article. And Churchill goes on to say there is nothing for which they have less respect than for weakness, and therefore proposes that the Soviets need to be met with strength. Now, this is very important because, again, this suggests as early as March 46 that the Western allies were worried about endless Soviet expansion, and that knew that they had to meet that with aggression. So again, I'm suggesting to you this is a massive overreaction, a misunderstanding of what the Soviets were about, and that therefore the Americans and their Western allies take a situation which was always going to be a little bit awkward and uncertain, but they transform it into being hostile and aggressive. The final document that I suggested that you look at in connection with these is the Truman Doctrine. Now, the Truman Doctrine is a speech by Truman, and this actually was in 1947. Just looking for a date, I think it's in March 47, but you probably want to check that yourself. And the context of this was that Britain had told America that they could no longer support Turkey and, more importantly, Greece, and that maybe the Americans would need to take that over. Britain could no longer afford it, and so Truman is looking for cash from Congress and goes to Congress and makes this speech basically saying, I need a lot of money from you, and this is the principle, the doctrine upon which I think that you should give it to me. The most important bit for me in this speech, I think, is the way Truman says, I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation, undermining takeover by armed minorities or by outside pressures. And he sets this in the context of tyranny against the will of the majority in free institutions. So he very much sets it up as being good guys against bad guys, freedom against tyranny, and that America is on the side of the good guys, and that they're going to support anyone who is resisting takeover. He doesn't say by communism, but it's clear that he means communism in the context of Greece and Turkey. And he specifically asked Congress for money to help Greece and Turkey, and the concern, of course, that the Soviets are looking to take them over. Now, the important thing here is that in order to get that cash, he needs to make it sound like there is an imminent takeover, even if he doesn't quite believe it. So Truman absolutely makes this sound like there's a conflict going on, and in doing so, in a public speech, makes the Soviets sound even worse than he fears they are. This, of course, not only promotes the idea of aggressive countermeasures, but also makes the Americans sound publicly aggressive against the Soviets. And again, like with actually the Iron Curtain, Stalin reacts to the Truman Doctrine with fury, and sees it as being a deliberately provocative, aggressive speech that he's made. So I hope that kind of makes sense of some of the context of these documents. They're quite important because they shape American policy, and as I was saying, I think they shape it as being potentially an aggressive overreaction to what they see the Soviets doing in Eastern Europe at this time. And bear in mind, of course, the dates, because even in early 1947, the communist takeover of Eastern Europe is by no means complete, and certainly when the Long Telegram and Iron Curtain speech are made, again, looking back at the Eastern European takeover, that also is not complete by that stage. I hope that's helpful and clarifies some of the stuff that you've been looking at, and I'll see you soon. Cheerio.